Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter.
Greg Jefferson, business columnist and editor.
You seemed a little confused about that for a second.
Well, I changed it up a little bit. I wanted to add the columnist thing. But
That's
then
true.
it's like the title business editor and columnist Greg Jefferson was really it's as long and dragging as this bit is turning into.
I like this bit.
we need more bits on this podcast.
Yeah.
Right.
That's we get a lot of emails about that.
Yeah.
Asking for more bits.
Bits.
Yeah.
We need more aimlessness.
True.
And while we're on the subject of aimlessness, I think we got some news on the firefighters contract. No, that was an odd segue. But Josh, you've been all over this story, and I mean, I guess the bottom line is here: we finally know it's official. There is a new 5-year deal for the firefighters union, and this is basically 6 years after the old one expired. They've been in Evergreen for about 6 years, right?
Yeah. So they have this new 5-year contract that's in place that was handed down by the 3-member arbitration panel. They met for a couple of weeks in December, and last week it finally came down. This whole saga is over. Mm-hmm. The fire union has a deal, and what it does is basically gives nothing to the fire union that they had sought. I mean, that's like it's
like one of the things
that
they sought early on was they wanted to basically to have to take control of the fund. Of the healthcare fund, which they abandoned that.
Yeah. So the big thing that they had sought was control of their own healthcare, and what they wanted was basically this separate healthcare fund that they called the Healthcare Trust. And they backed away from that during the arbitration proceedings. I guess as soon as it was clear that they weren't going to get it.
Yeah, I mean, that was a non-starter for the city, right?
Right, yeah. And so basically what they now have to abide by is this 2-tiered plan that the police union agreed to. They also are getting wage increases that aren't as generous as like what the police union agreed to about 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
So overall, I mean, it looks like, they gambled big on this arbitration process, and they came out, they walked away with little that they had initially sought.
Yeah, and the numbers are a little off because when we talk about the pay raises and we start looking at how much they add up to over a period of years, they're compounded. So that's take that into account. But if we just look at the percentage of increase over the years, I think the police union raises added up to 14%, and for the firefighters it's like 10%.
Yeah,
and they've lost out on several years of pay raises. There's now a pretty good gap. I can't remember the exact amount, but I think if you look at the median pay for police and fire, it was almost identical 5-6 years ago, and now there's maybe about an $8,000 gap between them, and that you can pin a lot of that on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something that should be brought up in the fact that both sides on Thursday they rushed to declare victory on this. Both sides acknowledge that San Antonio firefighters are still among the best paid in the state.
Yeah.
So
still, I mean, there's some irony here in that this arbitration process came about because they changed they went out, they got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of signatures to change the city charter, to put that up for a vote. They got it, and in the end, they didn't benefit so much from it.
It backfired on them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing. And this gets to a point, and we've talked about this a little bit. I can't remember if we talked about it on the podcast a few weeks ago when we got the sort of early indications of what the contract was going to be. But there is kind of a narrative there that this was kind of the city was had and Cheryl Scully in particular was kind of like a mastermind and was kind of orchestrating this, and the fire union sort of fell into the trap. And I just want to say I certainly think the city came out of this well, and it was I think a big loss for the fire union. Right. But I think the city kind of bumbled into a victory here, because I don't think there's any way you could have said in 2014 when Cheryl Scully was encouraging the council members to initiate lawsuits against both the police and fire over 10-year evergreen clauses that the city had already agreed to. I don't think you'd say, well, if we do this, then they're going to launch a petition drive to put propositions on the ballot, and then they're going to play themselves and activate the binding arbitration clause, and they're going to lose. I mean, that is not a plan.
No, it's not a plan. And I think the truth of the matter is both sides, Cheryl Scully on one, the union on the other. They just lost their minds politically. It just got, it escalated. She came under personal attack. She responded through the media. She totally engaged, and her position clearly hardened. I mean, she became inflexible, and the idea of dropping the lawsuit against the union was almost verboten around City Hall. You just did not seriously mention it, even though it would have been, there were a lot of good arguments to do it. It just never got a fair hearing.
Yeah. And the lawsuit was a failure. The city was hoping that they would get to the Texas Supreme Court and win there, and it never even got heard. And they spent money and time on this, and so when you talk about the spin that we saw on this last week, I mean, what was Chris Steele, the president of the fire union, saying about it? How was he trying to?
So he was trying to really put a positive face on it. I mean, clearly, like after all of this time, you kind of have to come out and sort of say, hey, look, like this is a good deal, which is what he did. Even though he didn't get the healthcare trust as the union wanted, he says he still wants a trust, and that he thinks that would be the best thing for the city. There's a lot of disagreement about that. Then the other thing that he was, as far as the specifics went, we were talking about the evergreen clause, and he said, he's not worried about the fact that under this contract, the 10-year evergreen clause has been halved. It is now 5 years. Mm-hmm. So, like, when a contract expires, certain benefits remain in place. But he was saying, I'm not worried about that. We still have arbitration.
Yeah. And it worked out so well.
It was brilliant. It worked out brilliantly. Brilliant.
Well, this gets, and I'm glad you mentioned the evergreen, because, we'd always kind of been led to believe that, this long evergreen, it benefits the unions because they had, rich health benefits. And so this was something that was a big frustration for the city. And as you said, now it's been halved. I'm wondering, do you all think that either the police or the fire union would ever, and particularly the fire union, would they ever risk going this deep, even take it to the 5 years that they could do it now again after how they got burned this time? I
would be shocked. And I think, you've got a completely new dynamic, obviously, with Eric Walsh. I mean, he's been the city manager for a year, but he's always had a pretty, a better relationship with union leaders, both police and fire, I think, than Scully did, especially in, her last few years at City Hall. So, I mean, that's a good basis for the next round of negotiations. But I'm curious about what the rank and file feels at the fire union. Mm-hmm. Like, if I were them, I'd probably be a little upset that we've spent this much time and money, and this is what we've gotten.
Well, it was notable that, usually when you have one of these press conferences at the fire union, you're appearing, if you're Chris Steele, you're appearing, in front of like a phalanx of firefighters, mm-hmm. Or union members. And the only other person up there was Rudy Morales.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And otherwise he was alone. Like, I think that, in terms of just that image alone, like, it tells you a lot about like how union members feel. And I've heard different things that, okay, there's a little bit of disappointment in the ranks. I've also heard that basically that they had their sort of information sessions and everything that kind of smoothed things over a little bit. But it's pretty unclear at this point.
And you look at all the effort and expense that they put into getting, the petition signatures for the propositions in a couple of years ago, and what do they have to show for that? So, I mean, Yeah, it would be really interesting to see where Chris Steele goes from here.
Yeah, I mean, they could have, he could have used what the police union did 4 or 5 years ago as a template, and didn't do that. And I'm sure Mike Kelly with the police union is just having a good laugh.
Absolutely, because Chris Steele pretty much ridiculed the police union, for just basically saying they were sellouts, and they've been getting their pay raises since while the Pirates have been watching. Another big story at City Hall that emerged last week was the decision by the council. It had been talked about in recent weeks. The decision to set a date for the pre-K 4SA vote, which would basically extend. I think pre-K 4SA has been in place for 8 years. This would extend it. How much longer would this? Would it be another 8 years? Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
In terms of the period, I can't remember off the top of my head what the period is.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot of... What's interesting about this is basically the notion that the reason that they're putting it on the May ballot is that they don't want to clutter the November ballot.
Right.
They basically want to clear a path for the Connect SA vote. Shifting, basically shifting the transportation tax to aquifer or I'm totally bungling this.
No, you do good.
There's some. It's all just spaghetti.
It's too many syllables. You're saying too many words. Too many syllables. Right?
Keep all of that in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically, say we're going to use the sales tax that currently funds aquifer protection and shifting it to transportation. That's already going to be a huge lift. And they basically want to clear and add in all of the the controversy that's going to be around the presidential elections, and you're just setting yourself up for
when you have a big turnout. It's just kind of an unknown because so many people turn out for presidential election. This is would have been at the bottom of the ballot, and nobody would know.
Yeah, which is what Councilman Perry was bringing up. It's like you guys just want to clear the ballot or clear the runway for.
And so he was unhappy about that.
Yeah.
I do think it's funny that think about how the politics have changed over the last decade.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost hard to remember now, but pre-K for SA, the first election was fairly controversial. I mean, it wasn't an absolute slam dunk, but in this case, I mean, I think there does seem to be more support for it than there used to be. I mean, I understand the move, not wanting to confuse things and maybe screw up this vote. Yet on the other hand, really what you're doing is saying the fewer the voters here, the better.
Yeah. We keep it simple. We want people who know, who are really familiar with the issue and are going to turn out specifically for this.
Right.
There was a poll that came out last week, the Fairfax poll, which I think Christian Archer, who actually ran the campaign for pre-K for SA in 2012, he was behind this. And it was looking at, the public sentiments on aquifer protection and various things. And I think the pre-K support was around 68%, something like that. So, I mean, it looks pretty good. I mean, it all depends on who actually, because people are going to have to make an effort to come out for this vote, for this issue. So that's always a question mark. But, I always go back to this idea of, in what was it, 65, 66, that you had Medicare pass, Medicare and Medicaid, and it was a controversial thing. And then 2 years later, like Richard Nixon's running for president as a Republican in 68. He's not threatening to do away. I mean, give people a couple of years and they get used to it, and you start. No, it's not really great politics to want to take it away. I mean, maybe the Affordable Care Act has been an exception, but generally that's true. And I think the problem with pre-K politically, I think the tough part is that it affects a fairly small group of people directly. It's a couple of thousand kids, although I think they also contribute funds to help, some of the other schools in the city. But there are a lot of people who probably don't feel a direct impact from it. But on the other hand, people have gotten used to it. They're not so upset about this tax because we've been paying it now for 7-8 years. So
and it's still kind of it's a bit of a lightning rod for some local conservatives. I mean, you had Lyle Larson say, in his letter to the mayor, hey, look, if you want to fund public transit, don't look at the aquifer. Go get it at a pre-K for SA. Remember that time we went and funded pre-K at the ledge, like
Yeah.
just dip into that.
Yeah.
Which is, and then what the legislature did was it expanded for the eligible students. It went
Right.
from, it allowed them to go from half day to full day. But and we're going to hear a lot about this
Right.
in the next few weeks. But it didn't really expand the number of people who are eligible. Well, along those lines, we've got a big election in Texas this week. We're seeing the beginning of early voting. We've got the March 3rd Democratic and Republican primaries, and Texas is going to be one of 14 states voting on what is called Super Tuesday. I think by March 4th, we're going to have a pretty good idea of we may not know who the Democratic presidential nominee is, but I think it'll probably be down to a couple of people. And, we've seen Joe Biden opened a campaign office in San Antonio last week. Elizabeth Warren's had one for a while. I just wanted to point out that the Warren campaign office in San Antonio is like right next to the Simi's Indian restaurant, and the Biden campaign office is really close to the Luby's on North Main. So we kind of know. I don't know if that says anything about the campaigns, but we know where the campaign people are going to be eating a lot over the next few weeks. Michael Bloomberg has he opened 11 campaign offices in Texas like the weekend before last. So,
given Michael Bloomberg's media buys in Texas so far, I assumed everybody else had dropped out. I thought it was really
there's no room for anybody else. How can anybody else even get on the airwaves? Yeah.
I mean, he's pretty much in San Antonio. I'm looking into this right now. He's pretty much the only person on the air right now. It's basically him and Bernie Sanders. By my calculations, he spent about $3 million on local ad buys. So I mean, just saturating the airwaves.
So that's radio and television?
Just television.
Just television.
Just television that I have.
One of the fascinating things about Bloomberg has been that he's not only just carpet bombing the airwaves and social media, but there's been some talk about the fact that he's been paying such top dollar for operatives who've joined his campaign that you have Democrats in some states, running statewide races, local races, who are having trouble finding people to work their campaigns because Bloomberg is just taking all of them.
Well, I mean, I saw one report over the weekend where he's basically got the capacity. He could spend up to $3 million of his own wealth. I mean, he's got much more than that, but that might be the ceiling for him. But that's a pretty high ceiling. I mean, you can buy a lot of talent with that.
Right. And the latest thing we've heard from Texas as far as the presidential races, I mean, I think there was a Texas Tribune, a University of Texas poll. You had
Bernie was out in front with 27%.
Right.
I mean, but that's kind of
Biden was maybe a close second. Is that right?
I can't remember.
I think
the
that's
order,
right.
But I mean, it's the shape that I mean, it's no different here than it is in the rest of the country, where it's like you've got a solid base of support with Bernie. You've got, and then with everybody else who's considered a moderate, you've got everybody going like, I like a bit of this person, I like a bit of that person. And they have not coalesced behind one person. So you just see it kind of like divvied up. And it's the same in Texas.
And it's similar. What the Sanders position is similar to the Trump position in that when you had 16, 17 Republican candidates in the race, I think by the time you hit the actual primary elections, the number was smaller, but you still had a lot of candidates. And so the feeling was, he's got the loyal following of like 20, 25%. So the bigger the pool of candidates, the better for him. Once it gets down to 2 or 3, though, he's got a low ceiling and he's going to be in trouble. I think with Bernie Sanders, there's always this sense that he's got 25 or 30% who are just intensely loyal. He can count on them in most states, which is great if you've got a bunch of candidates in there. But if it gets down to 2 or 3, can he bring that number up?
Right.
I mean, it's possible that he can, but I think that's going to be the question. But in Texas, because we still have several in there, you got Elizabeth Warren in there. Bloomberg, I think, was at around 10%, but that could go up because people are seeing him everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just given his media buys and like the work, like the real person-to-person work he's actually doing in Texas. I mean, with over the weekend we got Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner,
right?
His big endorsement from him, and Bloomberg had been working him for weeks. Like he is diligent about working kind of those groups, those endorsements.
Part of what's coming with that, of course, is that there's also a lot of opposition research we've seen just in the last couple of weeks, and people are pulling out like old. Obviously, he will have to address. I think there's going to be a debate this week. He's going to have to address stop and frisk in New York, which he apologized for that policy in New York, but he apologized for it just before he got in the presidential race. About 15 years after becoming mayor.
And was defending it just a couple of years ago.
That's right. And so you got interviews where he was strongly defending it. I think he talked about how the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was caused, at least in part, by the abandonment of redlining policies.
Yeah, exactly.
Which that's
if bankers had just been allowed to discriminate and continued to do so, we wouldn't be in the mess we were in.
There have been questions about his his treatment of women at the workplace. I just saw a video from I think 2010, 2011 where he talked about what a disaster the Affordable Care Act was. And they're basically saying Barack Obama was well-intentioned, but this thing was a disgrace, I think was the word he used. So he's going to have a lot to answer for, but one of the things that really fascinated me, which I think showed how well these ads are working for him, and because a lot of these ads have Barack Obama in there. They've got images of Bloomberg and Obama together. You hear a voiceover from Obama's presidential years where he's talking about what a great problem solver Bloomberg is. If you look, there was a Quinnipiac poll that came out last week, which had Joe Biden's support among African Americans at 27%. 2 weeks before, it had been 49%. And Bloomberg had gone from 7% to 22%. So something's happening with that. And so with that, we're seeing a backlash. But I think he's, because Biden is struggling, and Biden is the chief anti-Bernie candidate for a lot of people. A lot of people who are thinking, I'm losing my Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders is too far left. If they sense that Biden isn't going to make it, that his campaign is collapsing, they're looking at Bloomberg and saying this guy's unlimited cash, and I think that's what you're going to see.
Oh yeah. I mean, with Bloomberg, I mean, he is not the most personable man I've ever seen.
That's right.
But he's benefited by
lots of money.
Well, lots of money. Yeah, obviously, there's that, and his strategy has kept him kind of out of the public eye. We haven't seen him in debates. Like, he hasn't been in the grind with all of the other candidates, because a lot of what we're talking about now, like his record on with women and stop and frisk, this would have come up months ago.
That's right.
And now it's in a sense, it's like there are some disadvantages to finding out about this stuff so kind of late in the cycle, but things are moving quickly, and there's not a lot of time to dwell on this. So we're going to move on from contest to contest, I think, from now on, and we'll be paying maybe not so much attention to this, to his negatives as we would have a few months ago.
That's right, because there's just so much going on. I think that's a great point. One of the people who's supporting him in Texas, who has San Antonio connections, is Cesar Blanco, who's a state representative running for state senate from El Paso, but he used to be the chief of staff for Ciro Rodriguez, who's a San Antonio congressman. And Cesar Blanco is doing a lot of campaign work for Mike Bloomberg, and has said that the plan that he put out a couple of weeks ago, talking about Latino empowerment, that this was one of the big things that sort of got him excited about the Bloomberg campaign. And I just want to kind of circle it back to San Antonio before we wrap up things by saying that one of the items on the Bloomberg Latino empowerment plan calls for paid sick leave. So if President Bloomberg would make paid sick leave a federal, that he would achieve it at the federal level. So then we wouldn't have to fight it out in Texas.
Interesting, considering that he was saying a couple of years ago that he didn't think we should raise the federal minimum wage. So
I think he's gonna have some interesting questions thrown at him in his first debate appearance, and he's gonna have some things he's gonna have to answer for. Well. Thanks so much for listening. Get out and vote if you have a chance this week, and we'll be back with you next week. Take care.